Allan's Wife by Ryder Haggard. Chapter 1. Early Days. It may be remembered that in the last pages of his diary, written just before his death, Allan Quatermain makes allusion to his long dead wife, stated that he has written of her fully elsewhere. When his death was known, his papers were handed to myself as his literary executor. Among them I found two manuscripts, of which the following is one. The other is simply a record of events wherein Mr. Quatermain was not personally concerned, a Zulu novel, the story of which was told to him by the hero many years after the tragedy had occurred. But with this we have nothing to do at present. I have often thought, Mr. Quatermain's manuscript begins, that I would set down on paper the events connected with my marriage, and the loss of my most dear wife. Many years have now passed since that event, and to some extent time has softened the old grief, though heaven knows it is still keen enough. On two or three occasions I have even begun the record. Once I gave it up because the writing of it depressed me beyond bearing, once because I was suddenly called away upon a journey, and the third time because a Kaffir boy found my manuscript convenient for lighting the kitchen fire. But now that I am at leisure here in England, I'll make a fourth attempt. If I succeed, the story may serve to interest someone in after years when I am dead and gone. Before that, I should not wish it to be published. It is a wild tale enough, and suggests some curious reflections. I am the son of a missionary. My father was originally curate in charge of a small parish in Oxfordshire. He had already been some 10 years married to my dear mother when he went there, and he had 4 children, of whom I was the youngest. I remember faintly the place where we lived. It was an ancient long grey house, facing the road. There was a very large tree of some sort in the garden. It was hollow, and we children used to play about inside of it, and knock knots of wood from the rough bark. We all slept in a kind of attic, and my mother always came and kissed us when we were in bed. I used to wake up and see her bending over me, a candle in her hand. There was a curious kind of pole projecting from the wall over my head. Once I was dreadfully frightened because my eldest brother made me hang to it by my hands. That is all I remember about our old home. It has been pulled down long ago, or I would journey there to see it. A little further down the road was a large house with big iron gates to it, and on the top of the gate pillars sat two stone lions, which were so hideous that I was afraid of them. Perhaps this sentiment was prophetic. One could see the house by peeping through the bars of the gates. It was a gloomy looking place, with a tall yew hedge round it. But in the summer time some flowers grew about the sundial and the grass plat. This house was called the Hall, and Squire Carson lived there. One Christmas, it must have been the Christmas before my father emigrated, or I should not remember it, we children went to a Christmas tree festivity in the Hall. There was a great party there, and footmen wearing red waistcoats stood at the door. In the dining room, which was panelled with a black oak, was the Christmas tree. Squire Carson stood in front of it. He was a tall, dark man, very quiet in his manners, and he wore a bunch of seals on his waistcoat. We used to think him old, but as a matter of fact he was then not more than 40. He had been, as I afterwards learned, a great traveller in his youth, and some 6 or 7 years before his death, this date he married a lady who was half a Spaniard, a Papist, my father called her. I can remember her well. She was small and very pretty, with a rounded figure, large black eyes, and glittering teeth. She spoke English with a curious accent. I suppose that I must have been a funny child to look at, and I know that my hair stood up on my head then as it does now, for I still have a sketch of myself that my mother made of me, in which this peculiarity is strongly marked. On this occasion of the Christmas tree, I remember that Mrs. Carson turned to a tall, foreign looking gentleman who stood beside her, and tapping him affectionately on the shoulder with her gold eyeglasses, said, "Look, cousin, look at that droll little boy with the big brown eyes. His hair is like a, what do you call him? Scrubbing brush. Oh, what a droll little boy." The tall gentleman pulled at his mustache and, taking Mrs. Carson's hand in his, began to smooth my hair down with it till I heard her whisper, "Leave go my hand, cousin. Thomas is looking like the thunderstorm." Thomas was the name of Mr. Carson, her husband. After that, I hid myself as well as I could behind a chair, for I was shy, and watched little Stella Carson, who was the squire's only child, giving the children presents of the tree. She was dressed as Father Christmas, with some soft white stuff round her lovely little face, and she had large dark eyes, which I thought more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. At last it came to my turn to receive a present. Oddly enough, considered in the light of future events, it was a large monkey. Stella reached it down from one of the lower boughs of the tree and handed it to me, saying, "That is my Christmas present to you, little Allan Quatermain." As she did to her sleeve, which was covered with cotton wool, spangled over with something that shone, touched one of the tapers and caught fire. How, I do not know, and the flames ran up her arm towards her throat. She stood quite still. I suppose that she was paralyzed with fear, and the ladies who were near screamed very loud, but did nothing. Then some impulse seized me. Perhaps instinct would be a better word to use, considering my age. I threw myself upon the child, and, beating at the fire with my hands, mercifully succeeded in extinguishing it before it really got hold. My wrists were so badly scorched that they had to be wrapped up in wool for a long time afterwards, but with the exception of a single burn upon her throat. Little Stella Carson was not much hurt. This is all that I remember about the Christmas tree at the Hall. What happened afterwards is lost to me, but to this day, in my sleep, I sometimes see little Stella's sweet face and the stare of terror in her dark eyes as the fire ran up her arm. This, however, is not wonderful, for I had, humanly speaking, saved the life of her who was destined to be my wife. The next event which I can recall clearly is that my mother and three brothers all fell ill for fever, owing, as I afterwards learned, to the poisoning of our well by some evil minded person who threw a dead sheep into it. It must have been while they were ill that Squire Carson came one day to the vicarage. The weather was still cold, for there was a fire in the study, and I sat before the fire writing letters on a piece of paper with a pencil, while my father walked up and down the room talking to himself. Afterwards, I knew that he was praying for the lives of his wife and children. Presently, a servant came to the door and said that someone wanted to see him. "It is the squire, sir," said the maid, "and he says he particularly wishes to see you." "Very well," answered my father, wearily, and presently Squire Carson came in. His face was white and haggard, and his eyes shone so fiercely that I was afraid of him. "Forgive me for intruding on you at such a time, Quatermain," he said in a hoarse voice, "but tomorrow I leave this place forever, and I wish to speak to you before I go. Indeed, I must speak to you. Shall I send Allan away? Said my father, pointing to me. No, let him bide. He will not understand. Nor indeed did I at the time, but I remembered every word, and in after years their meaning grew on me. First tell me, he went on, how are they? And he pointed upwards with his thumb. My wife and two of the boys are beyond hope, my father answered, with a groan. I do not know how it will go with the third. The Lord's will be done. The Lord's will be done, the squire echoed solemnly. And now, Quatermain, listen. My wife's gone. Gone? My father answered. Who with? With that foreign cousin of hers. It seems from a letter she left me that she always cared for him, not for me. She married me because she thought me a rich English maillard. Now she has run through my property, or most of it, and gone, I don't know where. Luckily, she did not care to encumber her new career with a child. Stella is left to me. That is what comes of marrying a papist, Carson, said my father. That was his fault. He was as good and charitable a man as ever lived, but he was bigoted. What are you going to do? Follow her? He laughed bitterly in answer. Follow her, he said. Why should I follow her? If I met her, I might kill her or him, or both of them, because of the disgrace they have brought upon my child's name. No, I never want to look upon her face again. I trusted her, I tell you, and she has betrayed me. Let her go and find her fate. But I am going too. I am weary of my life. Surely, Carson, surely, said my father. You do not mean. No, no, not that. Death comes soon enough. But I'll leave this civilized world, which is a lie. We will go right away into the wilds, and I and my child, and hide our shame. Where? I do not know where. Anywhere. So long as there are no white faces, no smooth educated tongues. You are mad, Carson, my father answered. How will you live? How can you educate Stella? Be a man and wear it down. I will be a man and I will wear it down, but not here. Quatermain. Education? Was not she that woman who was my wife? Was not she highly educated? The cleverest woman in the country, forsooth? Too clever for me, Quatermain. Too clever by half. No, no. Stella shall be brought up in a different school. If it is possible, she shall forget her very name. Goodbye, old friend. Goodbye forever. Do not try to find me out. Henceforth, I shall be like one dead to you and all I knew. And he was gone. Mad, said my father with a heavy sigh. His trouble has turned his brain, but he will think better of it. At the moment, the nurse came hurrying in and whispered something in his ear. My father's face turned deadly pale. He clutched at the table to support himself, then staggered from the room. My mother was dying. It was some days afterwards, I did not know exactly how long, that my father took me by the hand and led me upstairs into the big room, which had been my mother's bedroom. There she lay, dead in her coffin, with the flowers in her hand. Along the wall of the room was arranged three little white beds, and on each of the beds lay one of my brothers. They all looked as though they were asleep, and they all had flowers in their hands. My father told me to kiss them, because I should not see them any more, and I did so, though I was very frightened. I did not know why. Then he took me in his arms and kissed me. The Lord hath given, he said, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I cried very much, and he took me downstairs, and after that I have only a confused memory of men dressed in black carrying heavy burdens towards the great churchyard. Next comes a vision of a great ship and wide tossing waters. My father could no longer bear to live in England after the loss that had fallen on him, and made up his mind to emigrate to South Africa. We must have been poor at the time. Indeed, I believe that a large portion of our income went from my father on my mother's death. At any rate, we traveled with the steerage passengers, and the intense discomfort of the journey with the rough ways of our fellow immigrants still remain upon my mind. At last it came to an end, and we reached Africa, which I was not to leave again for many, many years. In those days, civilization had not made any great progress in southern Africa. My father went up the country and became a missionary among the Kaffirs, near to where the town of Cradock now stands, and here I grew to manhood. There were a few poor farmers in the neighborhood, and gradually a little settlement of whites gathered round our mission station. A drunken Scotch blacksmith and wheelwright was about the most interesting character, who, when he was sober, could, could quote the Scottish poet Burns and the Ingold Bay legends, then recently published literally by the page. It was from that I contracted a fondness of the latter amusing writings, which has never left me. Burns I never cared for so much, probably because of the Scottish dialect which repelled me. What little education I got was from my father, but I never had much learning towards books, nor he much time to teach them to me. On the other hand, I was always a keen observer of the ways of men and nature. By the time that I was 20, I could speak Dutch and three or four Kaffir dialects perfectly, and I doubt if there was anybody in South Africa who understood native ways of thought and action more completely than I did. Also, I was really a very good shot at horseman, and I think, as indeed my subsequent career proves to have been the case, a great deal together than the majority of men. Though I was then, as now, light and small, nothing seemed to tire me. I could bear any amount of exposure and privation, and I never met the native who was my master in feats of endurance. Of course, all that is different now. I am speaking of my early manhood. It may be wondered that I did not run absolutely wild in such surroundings, but I was held back from this by my father's society. He was one of the gentlest and most refined men that I ever met. Even the most savage Kaffir loved him, and his influence was a very good one for me. He used to call himself one of the world's failures. With that, there were more such failures. Every morning, when his work was done, he would take his prayer book and, sitting on the little stoep or veranda of our station, would read for the evening psalms to himself. Sometimes there was not light enough for this, but it made no difference. He knew them all by heart. When he had finished, he would look out across the cultivated lands where the mission Kaffirs had their hut. But I knew it was not these he saw, but rather the great English church, and the graves ranged side by side before the yew near the wicket gate. It was there on the stoep that he died. He had not been well, and one evening I was talking to him, and his mind went back to Oxfordshire and my mother. He spoke of her a good deal, saying that she had never been out of his mind for a single day during all these years, and that he rejoiced to think he was drawing near that land whither she had gone. Then he asked me if I remembered the night when Squire Carson came into the study at the vicarage and told him that his wife had run away and that he was going to change his name and bury himself in some remote land. I answered that I remembered it perfectly. I wonder where he went to, said my father, And if he and his daughter Stella are still alive, well, well, I shall never meet them again. But life is a strange thing, Alan, and you may, if you ever do, give them my kind love. After that, I left him. We had been suffering more than usual from the depredation of the Kaffir thieves, who stole our sheep at night, and as I had done before, and not without success, I determined to watch the kraal and see if I could catch them. Indeed, it was from this habit of mine of watching at night that I first got my native name of Makomazan, which may be roughly translated as he who sleeps with one eye open. So I took my rifle and rose to go. But he called me to him and kissed me on the forehead, saying, God bless you, Allan. I hope that you will think of your old father sometimes, and that you will lead a good and happy life. I remember that I did not much like his tone at the time, but set it down to an attack of low spirits, to which he grew very subject as the years went on. I went down to the kraal and watched till within an hour of sunrise. Then, as no thieves appeared, returned to the station. As I came near, I was astonished to see a figure sitting in my father's chair. At first, I thought it must be a drunken Kaffir, then that my father had fallen asleep there, and so he had, for he was dead. Chapter 2. The Firefight. When I had buried my father and seen a successor installed in his place, for the station was the property of the society, I set to work to carry out a plan which I had long cherished, but been unable to execute because it would have involved separation from my father. Put shortly, it was to undertake a trading journey of exploration right through the countries now known as the Free State and the Transvaal, and as much further north as I could go. It was an adventurous scheme, for though the immigrant Boers had begun to occupy positions in these territories, they were still to all practical purposes unexplored. But I was now alone in the world, and it mattered little what became of me. So driven on by the overmastering love of adventure, which, old as I am, will perhaps still be the cause of my death, I determined to undertake the journey. Accordingly, I sold such stock and goods as we had upon the station, reserving only the two best wagons and two spans of oxen. The proceeds I invested in such goods as were then in fashion for trading purposes, and in guns and ammunition. The guns would have moved any modern explorer to merriment, but such as they were, I managed to do a good deal of execution with them. One of them was a single barreled, smooth bore fitted for percussion caps, a rower what we called it, which threw a 3 ounce ball and was charged with a handful of coarse black powder. Many is the elephant that I killed with the rower, although it generally knocked me backwards when I fired it, which I only did under compulsion. The best of the lot, perhaps, was a double barreled number 12 shotgun, but it had a flint locks. Also, there were some old tower muskets, which might or might not throw straight and at 70 yards. I took six Kaffirs with me, and the three good horses, which were supposed to be salted. That is proof against the sickness. Among the Kaffirs was an old fellow named Indaba Zimbi, which, being translated, means tongue of iron. I suppose he got his name from his strident voice and exhaustless eloquence. This man was a great character in his way. He had been a noted witch doctor among a neighborhood tribe, and came to the station under the following circumstances, which, as he plays a considerable part in his history, are perhaps worth recording. 2 years before my father's death, I had occasion to search the country round for some lost oxen. After a long and useless quest, it occurred to me that I had better go to the place where the oxen were buried by a Kafir chief, whose name I forgot, but whose kraal was about 50 miles from our station. There I journeyed and found the oxen safe at home. The chief entertained me handsomely, and on the following morning I went to pay my respects to him before leaving, and was somewhat surprised to find a collection of some hundreds of men and women sitting round him anxiously watching the sky in which the thunder clouds were banking up in a very ominous way. "You had better wait, white man," said the chief, "and see the rain doctors fight the lightning." I inquired what he meant, and learned that this man, Indaba Zimbi, had for some years occupied the position of wizard in chief to the tribe, although he was not a member of it, having been born in the country now known as Zululand. But a son of the chief's, a man of about 30, had lately set up as a rival in supernatural powers. This irritated Indaba Zimbi beyond measure, and a quarrel ensued between the two witch doctors that resulted in a challenge to trial by lightning being given and accepted. These were the conditions. The rivals must await the coming of a serious thunderstorm. No ordinary tempest would serve their run. Then, carrying assegais in their hands, they must take their stand within 50 paces of each other upon a certain patch of ground where the big thunderbolts were observed to strike continually, and by the exercise of their occult power and invocations to the lightning, must strive to avert death from themselves and bring it on their rival. The terms of this singular match had been arranged a month previously, but no storm worthy of an occasion had arisen. Now the local weather prophets believed it to be the brewing. I inquired what would happen if neither of the men were struck, and was told that they must then wait for another storm. If they escaped the second time, however, they would be held to be equal in power, and be jointly consulted by the tribe upon occasions of importance. The prospect of being a spectator of an unusual sight overcame my desire to be gone, and I accepted the chief's invitation to see it out. Before midday, I regretted it, for though the western heavens grew darker and darker, and the still air heralded the coming of the storm, yet it did not come. By 4 o'clock, however, it became obvious that it must burst soon, at sunset. The old chief said, and in the company of the whole assembly, I moved down to the place of combat. The kraal was built on the top of a hill, and below it the land sloped gently to the banks of a river about half a mile away. On the hither side of the bank was the piece of land that was, the natives said, loved of the lightning. Here the magicians took up their stand, while the spectators grouped themselves on the hillside about 200 yards away, which was, I thought, rather too near to the pleasant. When we had sat there for a while, my curiosity overcame me, and I asked leave of the chief to go down and inspect the arena. He said I might do so at my own risk. I told him that the fire from above would not hurt white men, and went to find that the spot was a bed of iron ore, thinly covered with grass, which of course accounted for its attracting the lightning from the storms as they traveled along the line of the river. At each end of this ironstone area were placed the combatants in Dabazimbi facing the east and his rival the west, and before each there burned a little fire made of some scented root. Moreover, They were dressed in all the paraphernalia of their craft, snakeskin, fish bladders, and I know not what beside, while round their necks hung circles of baboons' teeth and bones from human hands. First, I went to the western end, where the chief's son stood. He was pointing with his assagia towards the advancing storm and invoking it in a voice of great excitement. Come, fire, and lick up Indaba Zimbi. Hear me, storm devil, and lick Indaba Zimbi with your red tongue. Whirl him away in your breath. Make him as nothing. Melt the marrow in his bones. Run into his heart and burn away the lies. Show all the people who is the true witch finder. Let me not be put to shame in the eyes of this white man. Thus he spoke, or rather chanted, and all the while rubbed his broad chest, for he was a very fine man, with some filthy compound of medicine or moti. After a while, getting tired of his song, I walked across the iron stone to where Indaba Zimbi sat by his fire. He was not chanting at all, but his performance was much more impressive. It consisted in staring at the eastern sky, which was perfectly clear of cloud, and every now and again beckoning at it with his finger, then turning round to point with the assegai towards his rival. For a while I looked at him in silence. He was a curious, wizened man, apparently over 50 years of age, with thin hands that looked as tough as wire. His nose was much sharper than is usually among these races, and he had a queer habit of holding his head sideways like a bird when he spoke, which, in addition to the humor that lurked in his eyes, gave him a most comical appearance. Another strange thing about him was that he had a single white lock of hair among his black wool. At last I spoke to him. Indaba Zimbi, my friend, I said, you may be a good witch doctor, but you are certainly a fool. It is no good beckoning at the blue sky while your enemy is getting a start with the storm. You may be clever, but don't think you know everything, white man, the old fellow answered in a high, cracked voice and with something like a grin. They call you Iron Tongue, I went on. You had better use it, or the storm devil won't hear you. The fire from above runs down iron, he answered. So I keep my tongue quiet. Oh, yes, let him curse away. I'll put him out presently. Look now, white man. I looked, and in the eastern sky there grew a cloud. At first it was small, though very black, but it gathered with extraordinary rapidity. This was odd enough, but as I had seen the same thing happens before, it did not practically astonish me. It is by no means unusual in Africa for two thunderstorms to come up at the same time from different points of the compass. You had better get on, Indaba Zimbi, I said. The big storm is coming along fast, and will soon eat up the baby of yours. And I pointed to the west. Babies sometimes grew to giants, white man, said Indaba Zimbi, beckoning away vigorously. Look now at my cloud child. I looked. The eastern storm was spreading itself from earth to sky, and in shape resembled an enormous man. There was its head, its shoulders, and its legs. Yes, it was like a huge giant traveling across the heavens. The light of the setting sun escaping from beneath the lower edge of the western storm shot across the intervening space in a sheet of splendor, and lighting up the advancing figure of the cloud, wrapped its middle in hues of glory too wonderful to be described. But beneath and above this glowing belt, his feet and head were black as jet. Presently, as I watched, an awful flash of light shot from the head of the cloud. circled it about as though was a crown of living fire, and vanished. Aha! chuckled old Indabazimbi. My little boy is putting on his man's ring, and he tapped the gum ring on his own head, which natives assume when they reach a certain age and dignity. Now, white man, unless you are a bigger wizard than either of us, you had better clear off, for the firefight is about to begin. I thought this sounded wise. Good luck go with you, my black uncle, I said. I hope you don't feel the iniquities of a misspent life weighing on you at the last. You look after yourself and think of your own sins, young man, he answered with a grim smile and taking a pinch of snuff, while at that very moment a flash of lightning, I don't know from which storm, struck the ground within 30 paces of me. That was enough of me. I took to my heels, and as I went, I heard old Indaba Zimbi's dry chuckle of amusement. I climbed the hill till I came to where the chief was sitting with his indunas or headman, and sat down near to him. I looked at the man's face and saw that he was intensely anxious for his son's safety, and by no means confident of the young man's powers to resist the magic of Indaba Zimbi. He was talking in a low voice to the Induna next to him. I affected to take no notice and to be concentrating my attention on the novel scene before me, but in those days I had very quick ears and caught the drift of the conversation. Hearken, the chief was saying, if the magic of Indibazimbi prevails against my son, I'll endure him no more. Of this I am sure, that when he has slain my son, he will slay me also, and make himself chief in my place. I fear Indaba Zimbi. Black one, answered the Induna, wizards die as dogs die, and once dead, dogs bark no more. And once dead, said the chiefs, wizards work no more spells. And he bent and whispered in the Induna's ear, looking at the assegai in his hand as he whispered. Good, my father, good, said the Induna presently. It shall be done tonight, if the lightning does not do it first. A bad look out for old Indabas Zimbi, I said to myself. They meant to kill him. Then I thought no more of the matter for a while. The scene before me was too tremendous. The two storms were rapidly rushing together. Between them was a gulf of blue sky, and from time to time flashes of blinding light passed across this gulf, leaping from cloud to cloud. I remember that they reminded me of the story of the god Jove and his thunderbolts. The storm that was shaped like a giant and ringed with the glory of the sinking sun made an excellent Jove, and I am sure that the bolts which leapt from it could not have been surpasses even in mythological times. Oddly enough, as yet the flashes were not followed by thunder, a deadly stillness lay upon the place. The cattle stood silently on the hillside. Even the natives were awed to silence. Dark shadows crept along the bosom of the hills. The river to the right and left was hidden in wreaths of clouds. But before us and beyond the combatants, it shone like a line of silver beneath the narrowing space of open sky. Now the western tempest was scrawled all over with lines of intolerable light, while the inky head of the cloud giant to the east was continually suffused with a white and deadly glow that came and went in pulses, as though a blood of flame was being pumped into it from the heart of the storm. The silence deepened and deepened, the shadows grew blacker and blacker. Then suddenly all nature began to moan beneath the breath of an icy wind. On sped the wind, the smooth surface of the river was ruffled by it into little waves. The tall grass bowed low before it, and in its wake came the hissing sound of furious rain. Ah, the storms had met. From each there burst an awful blaze of dazzling flame, and now the hill on which we sat rocked at the noise of the following thunder. The light went out of the sky. Darkness fell suddenly on the land, but not for long. Presently the whole landscape grew vivid in the flashes. It appeared and disappeared. Now everything was visible for miles. Now even the man at my side vanished it in the blackness. The thunder rolled and cracked and pealed like the trump of doom. Whirlwinds tore around, lifting dust and even stones high into the air, and in a low continuous undertone rose the hiss of the rushing rain. I put my hand before my eyes to shield them from the terrible glare, and looked beneath it towards the list of iron stone. As a flash followed a flash from time to time, I caught sight of the two wizards. They were slowly advancing towards one another, each pointing at his foe with the assegai in his hand. I could see their every movement, and it seemed to me that the chain lightning was striking the iron stone all round them. Suddenly the thunder and lightning ceased for a minute. Everything grew black, and except for the rain, silent. It is over one way or the other, chief, I called out into the darkness. Wait, white man, wait, answered the chief, in a voice thick with anxiety and fear. Hardly were the words out of his mouth when the heavens were lit up again till they literally seemed to flame. There were the men, not 10 paces apart. A great flash fell between them. I saw then stagger beneath the shock. Indaba Zimbi recovered himself first. At any rate, when the next flash came, he was standing bolt upright, pointing with his assegai towards his enemy. The chief's son was still on his legs, but he was staggering like a drunken man, and the assegai had fallen from his hand. Darkness, then again a flash more fearful if possible than any that had gone before. To me it seemed to come from the east, right over the head of Indaba Zimbi. At that instant I saw the chief's son wrapped, as it were, in the heart of it. Then the thunder pealed, the rain burst over us like a torrent, and I saw no more. The worst of the storm was done, but for a while the darkness was so dense that we could not move, nor indeed was I inclined to leave the safety of the hillside where the lightning was never known to strike, and venture down to the iron stone. Occasionally there still came flashes, but search as we would, we could see no trace of either of the wizards. For my part, I believed that they were both dead. Now the clouds slowly rolled away down the course of the river, and with them went the rain, and now the stars shone in their wake. Let us go and see, said the old chief, rising and shaking the water from his hair. The firefight is ended. Let us go and see who has conquered. I rose and followed him, dripping as though I had swung 100 yards with my clothes on, and after me came all the people of the kraal. We reached the spot. Even in that light, I could see where the iron stone had been split and fused by the thunderbolts. While I was staring about me, I suddenly heard the chief, who was on my right, give a low moan, and saw the people cluster round him. I went up and looked. There on the ground lay the body of his son. It was a dreadful sight. The hair was burnt off his head. The copper rings upon his arms were fused. The assegai handle, which lay near, was literally shivered into threads. And then I took hold of his arm. It seemed to me that every bone of it was broken. The men with the chief stood gazing silently, while the women wailed. Great is the magic of Indaba Zimbi, said a man at length. The chief turned and struck him a heavy blow with the kerry in his hand. Great or not, thou dog, he shall die, he cried, and so shalt thou if thou singest his praises so loudly. I said nothing, but thinking it probable that Indaba Zimbi had shared the fare of his enemy, I went to look, but I could see nothing of him, and at length, being thoroughly chilled with the wet, started back to my wagon to change my clothes. On reaching it, I was rather surprised to see a strange Kaffir seated on the driving box wrapped up in a blanket. "Hello, come out of that," I said. The figure on the box slowly unrolled the blanket, and with great deliberation took a pinch of snuff. "It was a good firefight, white man, was it not?" said Indaba Zimbi in his high cracked voice. "But he never had a chance against me, poor boy. He knew nothing about it. See, white man, what becomes of presumption in the young. It is sad, very sad, but I made the flashes fly, didn't I?" "You old humbug," I said. "Unless you are careful, you will soon learn what comes of presumption in the old, for your chief is after you with a sage, and it will take all your magic to dodge that." "Now you don't say so," said Indaba Zimbi, clambering off the wagon with rapidity. "And all because of this wretched upstart. There is gratitude for you, white man. I expose him, and they want to kill me. Well, thank you for the hint. We shall meet again before long." And he was gone like a shot, and not too soon, for just then some of the chief's men came up to the wagon. On the following morning, I started homewards. The first face I saw on arriving at the station was that of Indaba Zimbi. "How do you do, Mokosmaka?" he said, holding his head on one side and nodding his white lock. "I hear you are Christians here, and I want to try a new religion. Mine must be a bad one, seeing that my people wanted to kill me for exposing an impostor." Chapter 3. Northwards. I make no apology to myself, or to anybody who may happen to read this narrative in future, for having set out the manner of my meeting with Indaba Zimbi. First, because it was curious, and secondly, because he takes some hand in the subsequent events. If that old man was a humbug, he was a very clever one. What amount of truth there was in his petitious to supernatural powers it is not for me to determine, though I may have my own opinion on the subject. But there was no mistake as to the extraordinary influence he exercised over his fellow natives. Also, he quite got round my poor father. At first, the old gentleman declined to have him at the station, for he had a great horror of these Kaffir wizards or witch finders. But Indaba Zimbi persuaded him that he was anxious to investigate the truths of Christianity, and challenged him to a discussion. The argument lasted 2 years, to the time of my father's death, indeed. The argument lasted 2 years. At the conclusion of each stage, Indaba Zimbi would remark, in the words of the Roman governor, "Almost praying white man, thou persuadest me to become a Christian." But he never quite became one. Indeed, I do not think he ever meant to. It was to him that my father addressed his letters to a native doubter. This work, which unfortunately remains in manuscript, is full of wise saws and learned instances. It ought to be published together with a précis of the doubter's answers, which were verbal. So the talk went on. If my father had lived, I believe it would be going on now, for both the disputants were quite inexcusable. Meanwhile, Indaba Zimbi was allowed to live on the station on condition that he practiced no witchcraft, which my father firmly believed to be a wile of devil. He said that he would not, but for all that there was never an ox lost or a sudden death, but he was consulted by those interested. When he had been with us a year, a deputation came to him from the tribe he had left, asking him to return. Things had not gone well with him since he went away, they said, and now the chief, his enemy, was dead. Old Indaba Zimbi listened to them till they had done, and as he listened, raked sand into a little heap with his toes. Then he spoke, pointing to the little heap. There is your tribe before 3 moons are gone. Nothing is left of it. You drove me away. I'll have no more to do with you. But when you are being killed, think of my works. The messengers went. 3 months afterwards, I heard that the whole community had been wiped out by an impi of raiding Pondos. When I was at length ready to start upon my expedition, I went to old Indaba Zimbi to say goodbye to him, and was rather surprised to find him engaged in rolling up medicine, assegays, and other sundries in his blankets. Goodbye, Indaba Zimbi, I said. I'm going to trek north. Yes, Macomazan, he answered, with his head on one side. And so am I. I want to see that country. We will go together. Will we? I said. Wait till you are asked, you old humbug. You had better ask me then, Macomazan, for if you don't, you will never come back alive. Now that the old chief my father is gone to where the storms come from, and he nodded to the sky, I feel myself getting into bad habits again. So last night I just threw up the bones and worked out about your journey. And I can tell you this, that if you don't take me, you will die. And what is more, you will lose one who is dearer to you than life is a strange fashion. So just because you gave me that hint a couple of years ago, I made up my mind to come with you. Don't talk stuff to me, I said. Ah, very well, Macomazan, very well. But what happened to my own people 6 months ago, and what did I tell the messengers would happen? They drove me away, and they are gone. If you drive me away, you will soon be gone too. And he nodded his white lock at me and smiled. Now I was not more superstitious than other people, but somehow old Indaba Zimbi impressed me. Also, I knew his extraordinary influence over every class of native, and bethought me that he might be useful in that way. All right, I said, I appoint you witchfinder to the expedition without pay. First serve, then ask for wages, he answered. I'm glad to see that you have enough imagination not to be altogether a fool, like most white men, Macomazan. Yes, yes, it is a want of imagination that makes people fools. They won't believe that they can't understand. You can't understand my prophecies any more than the fool at the kraal could understand that I was his master with the lightning. Well, it is time to trek, but if I were you, Macumazan, I should take one wagon, not two. Why? I said. Because you will lose your wagons, and it is better to lose one than two. Oh, nonsense, I said. All right, Macumazan, live and learn. And without another word, he walked to the foremost wagon, put his bundle into it, and climbed onto the front seat. So, having bid an affectionate adieu to my white friends, including the old Scotchman who got drink in honor of the event, and quoted Burns till the tears ran down his face, at length I started, and travelled slowly northwards. For the first 3 weeks, nothing very particular befall me. Such Kaffirs as we came in contact with were friendly, and game literally swarmed. Nobody living in those parts of South Africa nowadays can have the remotest idea of what the veldt would like even 30 years ago. Often and often I have crept shivering onto my wagon box just as the sun rose and looked out. At first, one would see nothing but a vast field of white mist suffused towards the east by a tremulous golden glow, through which the tops of stony kopjes stood up like gigantic beacons. From the dense mist would come strange sounds, snorts, gruntings, bellows, and the thunder of countless hoofs. Presently, this great curtain would grow thinner, then it would melt, as the smoke from a pipe melts into the air, and for miles on miles the wide rolling country intersected with bush open to the view. But it was not tenantless as it is now, for as far as the eye could reach, it would be literally black with game. Here to the right might be a herd of wildebeests that could not number less than 2,000. Some were grazing, some gamboled, whisking their white tails into the air, while all round the old bulls stood upon hillocks, sniffing suspiciously at the breeze. There in the front, 100 yards away, though to the unpracticed eye they looked much closer because of the dazzling clearness of the atmosphere, was a great herd of springbok trekking along in single file. Ah, they have come to the wagon track and do not like the look of it. What will they do? Go back? Not a bit of it. It is nearly 30 feet wide, but that is nothing to a springbok. See the first of them bounce into the air like a ball. How beautifully the sunshine gleams upon his golden hide. He has cleared it, and the others come after him in numberless succession, all except the fawns, who cannot jump so far, and have to scamper over the doubtful path with a terrified bah. What is that yonder moving about the tops of the mimosa? In the little dell at the foot of the copy, giraffes, by George, 3 of them. There will be marrow bones for supper tonight. Hark! The ground shakes behind us, and over the brow of the rise rush a vast herd of blesbok. On they come at full gallop, their long heads held low. They look like so many bearded goats. I thought so. Behind them is a pack of wild dogs, their fur draggled, their tongues lolling. They are in full cry. The giraffes hear them and are away, rolling round the copy like a ship in a heavy sea. No marrow bones after all, see? The foremost dogs are close on a buck. He has galloped far and is outworn. One springs at his flank and misses him. The buck gives a kind of groan, looks wildly round and sees the wagon. He seems to hesitate a moment, then in his despair rushes up to it and falls exhausted among the oxen. The dogs pull up some 30 paces away, panting and snarling. Now, boy, the gun. No, not the rifle, the shotgun loaded with loopers. Bang, bang, there, my friends, 2 of you will never hunt back again. No, don't touch the buck, for he has come to us for shelter, and he shall have it. Ah, how beautiful is nature before man comes to spoil it! Such a sight as this have I seen many hundred times, and I hope to see it again before I die. The first real adventure that befell me on this particular journey was with elephants, which I will relate because of its curious termination. Just before we crossed the Orange River, we came to a stretch of forest land some 20 miles abroad. The night we entered this forest, we camped in a lovely open glade. A few yards ahead, Tamboki grass was growing to the height of a man, or rather it had been. Now, with the exception of a few stalks here and there, it was crushed quite flat. It was already dusk when we camped, but after the moon got up, I walked from the fire to see how this had happened. One glance was enough for me. A great herd of elephants had evidently passed over the tall grass not many hours before. The sight of their spoor rejoiced me exceedingly, for though I had seen wild elephants, at that time I had never shot one. Moreover, the sight of elephant spoor to the African hunter is what color in the pan is to the prospector of gold. It is by the ivory that he lives, and to shoot it or trade it is his chief aim in life. My resolution was soon taken. I would camp the wagons for a while in the forest and start on horseback after the elephants. I communicated my decision to Indaba Zimbi and the other Kaffirs. The latter were not loth, for your Kaffir loves hunting, which means plenty of meat and congenial occupation. But Indaba Zimbi would express no opinion. I saw him retire to a little fire that he had lit for himself and go through some mysterious performances with bones and clay mixed with ashes, which were watched with the greatest interest by the other Kaffirs. At length he rose, and coming forward informed me that it was all right, and that I did well to go and hunt the elephants, as I should get plenty of ivory, but he advised me to go on foot. I said I should do nothing of the sort, but meant to ride. I am wiser now. This was the first and last time that I ever attempted to hunt elephants on horseback. Accordingly, we started at dawn. Indaba Zimbi and three men, the rest as I left with the wagons. I was on horseback, and so was my driver, a good rider and a skillful shot for the Kafir. But Indaba Zimbi and the others walked. From dawn till midday, we followed the trail of the herd, which was as plain as a high road. Then we off saddled to let the horses rest and feed, and about 3 o'clock started on again. Another hour or so passed, and still there was no sign of elephants. Evidently, the herd had traveled fast and far, and I began to think that we should have to give it up. When suddenly I caught sight of a brown mass moving through the thorny trees on the side of a slope about a quarter of a mile away. My heart seemed to jump into my mouth. Where is the hunter who has not felt like this at the sight of his first elephant? I called a halt, and then the wind began being right. We set to work to stalk the bull. Very quietly I rode down the hither side of the slope till we came to the bottom, which was densely covered with bush. Here I saw the elephants had been feeding, for broken branches and upturned trees lay all about. I did not take too much notice, however, for all my thoughts were fixed upon the bull I was stalking, when suddenly my horse gave a violent start that nearly threw me from the saddle. And there came a mighty rush and upheaval of something in front of me. I looked. There was the hinder part of a second bull elephant, not 4 yards off. I could just catch sight of its outstretched ears projecting on either side. I had disrupted its sleeping, and it was running away. Obviously, the best thing to do would have been to let it run, but I was young in those days and foolish, and in the excitement of the moment I lifted my roer or elephant gun and fired at the great brute over my horse's head. The recoil of the heavy gun nearly knocked me off the horse. I recovered myself, however, and as I did so, saw the bull lurched forward, for the impact of a 3-ounce bullet in the flank will quicken the movement even of an elephant. By this time I had realized the folly of the shot, and devoutly hoped that the bull would take no further notice of it. But he took a different view of the matter, pulling himself up in a series of plunges. He spun round and came for me with outstretched ears and uplifted trunk, screaming terribly. I was quite defenseless, for my gun was empty, and my first thought was of escape. I dug my heels into the sides of my horse, but he would not move an inch. The poor animal was paralyzed with terror, and he simply stood still, his four legs outstretched and quivering all over like a leaf. On rushed the elephant, awful to see. I made one more vain effort to stir the horse. Now the trunk of the great bull swung aloft above my head. A thought flashed through my brain. Quick as a light, I rolled from the saddle. By the side of the horse lay a fallen tree, as thick through as man's body. The tree was lifted a little off the ground by the broken boughs, which took its weight, and with a single movement, so active as one in such necessities, I flung myself beneath it. As I did so, I heard the trunk of the elephant descend with a mighty thud on the back of my poor horse. And the next instant I was almost in darkness, for the horse, whose back was broken, fell over across the tree under which I lay ensconced. But he did not stop there long. In 10 seconds more, the ball had wound his trunk about my dead nag's neck, and with a mighty effort hurled him clear of the tree. I wriggled backwards as far as I could towards the roots of the tree, for I knew what he was after. Presently I saw the red tip of the bull's trunk stretching itself towards me. If he could manage to hook it around any part of me, I was lost. But in the position I occupied, that was just what he could not do, although he knelt down to facilitate his operations. On came the snapping tip like a great open mouthed snake. It closed upon my hat, which vanished. Again, it was thrust down, and a scream of rage was bellowed through it within 4 inches of my head. Now it seemed to elongate itself. Oh, heavens! Now it had me by the hair, which luckily for myself was not very long. Then it was my turn to scream, for next instant half a square inch of hair was dragged from my scalp by the roots. I was being plucked alive, as I have seen cruel Kafir's kitchen boys pluck a fowl. The elephant, however, disappointed with these moderate results, changed his tactics. He wound his trunk round the fallen tree and lifted. The tree stirred, but fortunately the broken branches embedded in the spongy soil, and some roots which still held, prevented it from being turned over. Though he lifted it so much that had it occurred to me, he could now easily have drawn me out with his trunk. Again he hoisted with all his mighty strength, and I saw that the tree was coming, and roared aloud for help. Some shots were fired close by an answer, but if they hit the ball, their only effect was to stir his energies to more active life. In another few seconds, my shelter would be torn away, and I should be done for. A cold perspiration burst out over me as I realized that I was lost. Then, of a sudden, I remembered that I had a pistol in my belt, which I often used for dispatching wounded game. It was loaded and capped. By this time, the tree was lifted so much that I could easily get my hand down to my middle and draw the pistol from its case. I drew and cocked it. Now the tree was coming over, and there, within 3 feet of my head, was the great brown trunk of the elephant. I placed the muzzle of the pistol within an inch of it and fired. The result was instantaneous. Down sunk the tree again, giving one of my legs a considerable squeeze, and next instant I heard a crashing sound. The elephant had bolted. By this time, what between fright and struggling, I was pretty well tired. I cannot remember how I got from under the fallen tree, or indeed anything, until I found myself sitting on the ground drinking some peach brandy from a flask, and old Indaba Zimbi opposite to me nodding his white lock sagely. while he fired off moral reflections on the narrowness of my escape and my unwisdom is not having taken his advice to go on foot. That reminded me of my horse. I got up and went to look at it. It was quite dead. The blow of the elephant's trunk had fallen on the saddle, breaking the framework and rendering it useless. I reflected that in another 2 seconds it would have fallen on me. Then I called to Ndiba Zambi and asked which way the elephants had gone. There, he said, pointing down the gully, and we had better go after him, Mukamazan. We have had the bad luck, now for the good. There was philosophy in this, though. To tell the truth, I did not feel practically sharp set on elephants at the moment. I seemed to have had enough of them. However, it would never do to show the white feather before the boys. So I ascended with much outward readiness, and we started, I on the second horse and the others on foot. When we had traveled for the best part of an hour down the valley, all of a sudden we came upon the whole herd, which numbered a little more than 80. Just in front of them, the bush was so thick that they seemed to hesitate about entering it, and the sides of the valley were so rocky and steep at this point that they could not climb them. They saw us at the same moment as we saw them, and inwardly I was filled with fears, lest they should take it into their heads to charge back up the gully. But they did not. Trumpeting aloud, they rushed at the thick bush, which went down before them like corn before a sickle. I do not think that in all my experiences I ever heard anything to equal the sound they made as they crashed through the over shrubs and trees. Before them was a dense forest belt from 100 to 150 feet in width. As they rushed on, it fell, so that behind them was nothing but a level roadway strewed with fallen trunks, crushed branches, and here and there a tree, too strong even for them, left stranded amid the wreck. On they went, and notwithstanding the nature of the ground over which they had to travel, they kept their distance ahead of us. This sort of thing continued for a mile or more, and then I saw that in front of the elephants the valley opened into a space covered with reeds and grass. It might have been 5 or 6 acres in extent, beyond which the valley ran on again. The herd reached the edge of this expanse and for a moment pulled up, hesitating, evidently by mistrusted it. My men yelled aloud, as only Kaffirs can, and that settled them. Headed by the wounded bull, whose marital ardor, like my own, was somewhat cooled, they spread out and dashed into the treacherous swamp for which it was though just then there was no water to be seen. For a few yards all went well with them, though they clearly found it heavy going. Then suddenly the great bull sank up to his belly in the stiff, peaty soil and remained fixed. The others, mad with fear, took no heed of his struggles and trumpeting but plunged on to meet the same fate. In 5 minutes, the whole herd of them were hopelessly bogged, and the more they struggled to escape, the deeper they sunk. There was one exception indeed. A cow managed to win back to firm shore, and lifting her trunk, prepared to charge us as we came up, but at that moment she heard the scream of her calf and rushed back to its assistance, only to be bogged with the others. Such a scene I never saw before or since. The swamp was spotted all over with the large forms of the elephants, and the air rang with their screams of rage and terror as they waved their trunks wildly to and fro. Now and then a monster would make a great effort and drag his mass from its peaty bed, only to stick fast again at the next step. It was a most pitiable sight, though one that gladdened the hearts of my men. Even the best natives have little compassion for the sufferings of animals. Well, the rest was easy. The marsh that would not bear the elephants carried our weight well enough. Before midnight, all were dead, for we shot them by moonlight. I would gladly have spared the young ones and some of the cows, but to do so would only to have meant leaving them to perish to hunger. It was kinder to kill them at once. The wounded bull I slew with my own hand, and I cannot say that I felt much complication in so doing. He knew me again and made a desperate effort to get at me, but I am glad to say that the peel held him fast. The pan presented a curious sight when the sun rose next morning. Owing to the support given by the soil, few of the dead elephants had fallen. There they stood as though they were asleep. I sent back for the wagons, and when they arrived on the morrow, formed a camp about a mile away from the pan. Then began the work of cutting out the elephant's tusks. Took over a week, and for obvious reasons was a disgusting task. Indeed, had it not been for the help of some wandering bushmen who took their pay in elephant meat, I do not think we could even have managed it. At last it was done. The ivory was far too cumbersome for us to carry, so we buried it. Having first got rid of our bushman allies, my boys wanted me to go back to the Cape with it and sell it, but I was too much bent on my journey to do this. The tusks lay buried for 5 years. Then I came and dug them up. They were but little harmed. Ultimately, I sold the ivory for something over 1,200 pounds. Not bad pay for one day's shooting. This was how I began my career as an elephant hunter. I have shot many hundreds of them since, but have never again attempted to do so on horseback. Chapter 4. The Zolo MP. After burying the elephant tusks and having taken careful notes of the bearings and peculiarities of the country so that I might be able to find the spot again, we proceeded on our journey. For a month or more, I trekked along the line which now divides the Orange Free State from Griqualand West and the Transvaal from Buchanan Land. The only difficulties met with were such as are still common to African travelers: occasional want of water and troubles about crossing sloughs and rivers. I remember that I outspanned on the spot where Kimberley now stands and had to press on again in a hurry because there was no water. I little dreamt then that I should live to see Kimberley, a great city, producing millions of pounds worth of diamonds annually. And old Indaba Zimbi's magic cannot have been worth so much after all, or he would have told me. I found the country almost entirely depopulated. Not very long before Mozili Kodza, the lion, Chaka's general, had swept across it in his progress towards what is now Matabiland. His footsteps were evident enough. Time upon time I trekked up to what had evidently been the sites of Kaffir kraals. Now the kraals were ashes and piles of tumbled stones, and strewn about among the rank grass were the bones of hundreds of men, women, and children, all of whom had kissed the Zulu assegai. I remember that in one of these desolate places I found the skull of a child in which a ground lark had built its nest. It was the twittering of the young birds inside and first called my attention to it. Shortly after this, we met with the second great adventure, a much more serious and tragic one than the first. We were trekking parallel with the Kolong River when a herd of a blessbok crossed the track. I fired at one of them and hid it behind. It galloped about 100 yards with the rest of the herd, then lay down. As we were in want of meat, not having met with any game for a few days past, I jumped on to my horse and telling Indaba Zimbi that I would overtake the wagons or meet them on the further side of a rise about an hour's trek away. I started after the wounded buck. As soon as I came within 100 yards of it, however, it jumped up and ran away as fast as though it were untouched, only to lie down again at a distance. I followed, thinking the strength would soon fail it. This happened 3 times. On the third occasion, it vanished behind a ridge. And though by now I was out of both temper and patience, I thought I might as well ride to the crest and see if I could get a shot at it on the further side. I reached the ridge, which was strewn with stones, looked over it, and saw a Zulu impi. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Yes, there was no doubt of it. They were halted about 1,000 yards away by the water, somewhere lying down, somewhere cooking at fires. Others were stalking about with spears and shields in their hands. There might have been 2,000 or more of them in all, while I was wondering, and that with no little uneasiness, what on earth they could be doing there. Suddenly I heard a wild cry to the right and left of me. I glanced first one way, then the other. From either side a great Zulu was bearing down on me, their broad stabbing assegais aloft, and black shields in their left hands. The man to the right was about 15 yards away. He to the left was not more than 10. On they came, their fierce eyes almost staring out of their heads, and I felt, with a cold thrill of fear, that in another 3 seconds those broad banged ones might be buried in my vitals. On such occasions, we act, I suppose, more from instinct than from anything else. There is no time for thought. At any rate, I dropped the reins and, raising my gun, fired point blank at the left hand man. The bullet struck him in the middle of his shield, pierced it, and passed through him, and over he rolled upon the veldt. I swung round in the saddle. Most happily, my horse was accustomed to standing still when I fired from his back. Also, he was so surprised that he did not know which way to shy. The other savage was almost on me. His outstretched shield reached the muzzle of my gun as I pulled the trigger of the left barrel. It exploded. The warrior sprang high into the air and fell against my horse dead, his spear passing just in front of my face. Without waiting to reload or even to look if the main body of the Zulus had seen to death of their 2 scouts, I turned my horse and drove my heels into his sides. As soon as I was down the slope of the rise, I pulled a little to the right in order to intercept the wagons before the Zulus saw them. I had not gone 300 yards in this new direction when, to my utter astonishment, I struck a trail marked with wagons, wheels, and the hoofs of oxen. Of wagons there must have been at least 8, and several hundred cattle. Moreover, they had passed within 12 hours. I could tell that by the spoor. Then I understood. The MP was following the track of the wagons, which in all probability belonged to a party of emigrant Boers. The spoor of the wagons ran in the direction I wished to go, so I followed it. About a mile further on, I came to the crest of a rise, and there, about 5 furlongs away, I saw the wagons drawn up in a rough laager upon the banks of the river. There, too, were my own wagons trekking down to the slope towards them. In another 5 minutes I was there. The Boers, for Boers they were standing about outside the little laager, watching the approach of my 2 wagons. I called to them, and they turned and saw me. The very first man my eyes fell on was a boer named Hans Botha, whom I had known well years ago in the Cape. He was not a bad specimen of his class, but a very restless person with a great objection to authority, or as he expressed it, a love of freedom. He had joined the party of the immigrant powers some years before, but as I learned presently, and had quarreled with its leader, and was now trickling away into the wilderness to find to found a little colony of his own. Poor fellow, it was his last strike. How do you do, Mynheer Botha? I said to him in Dutch. The old man looked at me, looked again, then, startled out of his Dutch solidity, cried to his wife, who was seated on the box of the wagon, "Come here, Frau! Come! Here is Allan Quatermain, the Englishman, the son of the predicant. How goes it, here, Quatermain? And what is the news down in the Cape yonder?" "I don't know what the news is in the Cape, Hans," I answered solemnly, "but the news here is that there is a Zulu impi upon your spoor, and within 2 miles of the wagons. That I know, for I have just shot two of their centaurs, and I showed him my empty gun." For a moment there was a silence of astonishment, and I saw the bronzed faces of the men turn pale beneath their tan, while one or two of the women gave a little scream, and the children crept to their sides. "Almighty!" cried Hans, "that must be the Amtituwa regiment that Dingaan marshes that sent against the Bisutos. But who could not come at them because of the marshes, and so were afraid to return to Zululand and struck north to join Mosilikas." At this moment my own wagons came up. Indaba Zimbi was sitting on the box of the first, wrapped in a blanket. I called him and told him the news. "I'll tidings, Macumazahn," he said. "There will be dead Boers about tomorrow morning, but they will not attack till dawn. Then they will wipe out the lager so." And he passed his hand before his mouth. "Stop that croaking, you white-headed crow," I said, though I knew his words were true. "What chance had a lager of 10 wagons all told against at least 2,000 of the bravest savages in the world? "Macumazahn, will you take my advice this time?" Indaba Zimbi said presently. "What is it?" I asked. "This. Leave your wagons here. Jump on that horse, and let us two run for it is as hard as we can go. The Zulus won't follow us. They will be looking after the Boers." "I won't leave the other white men," I said. "It would be the act of a coward. If I die, I die." "Very well, Macumazahn, then stay and be killed," he answered, taking a pinch of snuff. "Come, let us see about the wagons." And we walked towards the lager. Here everything was in confusion. However, I got hold of Hans Botha and put it to him if it would not be best to desert the wagons and make a run for it. "How can we do it?" he answered. "Two of the women are too fat to go a mile, one is sick in childbed, and we have only 6 horses among us. Besides, if we did, we should starve in the desert." "No, Heer Allan, we must fight it out with the savages, and God help us." "God help us, indeed. Think of the children, Hans." "I can't bear to think," he answered in a broken voice, looking at his own little girl, a sweet curly-haired, blue-eyed child of 6, named Tota, whom I had often nursed as a baby. "Oh, Heer Allan, your father, the predicant, always warned me against trekking north, and I never would listen to him because I thought him a cursed Englishman. Now I see my folly. Heer Allan, if you can, try to save my child from those black devils. If you live longer than I do, or if you can't save her, kill her." And he clasped my hand. "It hasn't come to that yet, Hans," I said. Then we set to work on the lager. The wagons, of which including my two, there were 10, were drawn into the form of a square, and the diesel boom of each securely lashed with rheims to the underworks of that in front of it. The wheels also were locked, and the space between the ground and the bed planks of the wagons was stuffed with the branches of the wait a bit thorns that fortunately grew near in considerable quantities. In this way, a barrier was formed of no mean strength as against a foe unprovided with firearms, places being left for the men to fire from. In a little over an hour, everything was done that could be done, and a discussion arose as the disposal of the cattle, which had been driven up close to the camp. Some of the Boers were anxious to get them into the lager, small as it was, or at least as many of them as it would hold. I argued strongly against this, pointing out that the brutes would probably be seized with panic as soon as the firing began and trample the defenders of the lager underfoot. As an alternative plan, I suggested that some of the native servants should drive the herd along the valley of the river till they reached a friendly tribe or some other place of safety. Of course, if the Zulus saw them, they would be taken, but the nature of the ground was favorable, and it was possible that they might escape if they started at once. The presupposition was promptly agreed to, and what is more, it was settled that one Dutchman and such of the women and children as could travel should go with them. In half an hour's time, 12 of them started with the natives. The Boer in charge, and the cattle, 3 of my own men went with the latter. The 3 others and Indaba Zimbi stopped with me in the lager. The parting was a heart-breaking scene, upon which I do not care to dwell. The women wept, the men groaned, and the children looked on with scared white faces. At length they were gone, and I, for one, was thankful of it. There remained in the lager 17 white men, 4 natives, the 2 Boer fraus, who were too struck to travel, the woman in childbed and her baby, and Hans' brother's little daughter Tota, whom he could not make up his mind to part with. Happily, her mother was already dead, and here I may state that 10 of the women and children, together with about half of the cattle, escaped. The Zulu impi never saw them, and on the third day of travel they came to the forfeited place of a Greek chief, who sheltered them on receiving half the cattle in payment. Thence, by slow degrees, they journeyed down to the Cape Colony, reaching a civilized region within a little more than a year from the date of the attack on the lager. The afternoon was now drawing towards evening, but still there were no signs of the impi. A wild hope struck us that they might have gone on about their business. Ever since Indabazimbi had heard that the regiment was supposed to belong to the Amchitua tribe, he had, I noticed, been plunged in deep thought. Presently he came to me and volunteered to go out and spy upon their movements. At first, Hans Botha was against this idea, saying that he was a Verdomot Wurzels, as accused black creature, and would betray us. I pointed out that there was nothing to betray. The Zulus must know where the wagons were, but it was important for us to gain information of their movements. So it was agreed that Indaba Zimbi should go. I told him this. He nodded this white log, said, "All right, Mokomazan," and started. I noticed with some surprise, however, that before he did so, he went to the wagons and fetched his moti, or medicine, which, together with his other magic apparatus, he always carried in a skin bag. I asked him why he did this. He answered that it was to make himself invulnerable against the spears of the Zulus. I did not in the least believe his explanation, for in my heart I was sure that he meant to take the opportunity to make a bolt of it, leaving me to my fate. I did not, however, interfere to prevent this, for I had an affection for the old fellow, and sincerely hoped that he might escape the doom which overshadowed us. So Indaba Zimbi sauntered off, and as I looked at his retreating form, I thought I should never see it again. But I was mistaken, and little knew that he was risking his life, not for the Boers whom he hated one and all, but for me, whom in the queer way he loved. When he had gone, we completed our preparations for defense, strengthening the wagons and the thorns beneath with earth and stones. Then, at sunset, we ate and drank as heartily as we could under the circumstances, and when we had done, Hans Botha, as head of the party, offered up prayer to God for our preservation. It was a touching sight to see the burly Dutchman, his hat off, his broad face lit up by the last rays of the setting sun, praying aloud in homely, simple language to Him who alone could save us from the spears of a cruel foe. I remember that the last sentence of his prayer was, Almighty, if we must be killed, save the women and children and my little girl Tuta from the accursed Zulus, and do not let us be tortured. I echoed the request very earnestly in my own heart, that I know, for in common with the others, I was dreadfully afraid, and it must be admitted, not without reason. Then the darkness came on, and we took up our appointed places, each with a rifle in his hand, and peered out into the gloom and silence. Occasionally, one of the Boers would light his pipe with a brand from the smouldering fire, and the glow of it would shine for a few moments on his pale, anxious face. Behind me, one of the stout fraus lay upon the ground. Even the terror of our position could not keep her heavy eyes from their accustomed sleep, and she snored loudly. On the further side of her, just by the fire, lay little Tota, wrapped in a karos. She was asleep also, her thumb in her mouth, and from time to time her father would come to look at her. So the hours were on while we waited for the Zulus. But from my intimate knowledge of the habits of natives, I had little fear that they would attack us at night, though had they done so, they could have compassed our destruction with but a small loss to themselves. It is not the habit of this people. They like to fight in the light of a day, at dawn for preference. About 11 o'clock, just as I was nodding a little at my post, I heard a low whistle outside the laager. Instantly I was wide awake, and all along the line I heard the clicking of locks as the Boers cocked their guns. Mukmazan, said a voice, the voice of Indaba Zimbi. Are you there? Yes, I answered. Then hold the light so that I can see how to climb into the laager, he said. Yeah, yeah, hold the light. Put in one of the Boers. I don't trust that black scapels of yours. Here, Quatermain, he may have some of his countrymen with him. Accordingly, a lantern was produced and held towards the voice. There was Indaba Zimbi alone. We let him into the laager and asked him the news. This is the news, white men, he said. I waited till dark, and creeping up to the place where the Zulus were encamped, hid myself behind a stone and listened. They are a great regiment of Amtitos, as Bas Botha yonder thought. They struck the spoor of the wagons 3 days ago and followed it. Tonight they sleep upon their spears. Tomorrow at break, they will attack the laager and kill everybody. They are very bitter against the Boers because of the Battle of Blood River and the other fights. and that is why they followed the wagons instead of going straight north after Mosel cats. I tell you what it is, Hirin, I said. Instead of waiting to be butchered here, like buck in a pitfall, let us go out now and fall upon the MP while it sleeps. This proposition excited some discussion, but in the end, only one man could be found to vote for it. Boers, as a rule, lack that dash which makes great soldiers. Such forlorn hopes are not in their line, and rather than embark upon them, they prefer to take their chance in a lager, however poor that chance might be. For my own part, I firmly believe that had my advice been taken, we should have routed the Zulus. 17 desperate white men armed with guns would have produced no small effect upon a camp of sleeping savages, but it was not taken, so it is no use talking about it. After that, we went back to our posts, and slowly the weary night wore on towards the dawn. Only those who have watched under similar circumstances while they waited the advent of almost certain and cruel death can know the torturing suspense of those heavy hours. But they went somehow, and at last in the far east the sky began to lighten, while the cold breath of dawn stirred the tilts of the wagons and chilled me to the bone. The fat Dutch woman behind me woke with a yawn, then remembering all, moaned aloud, while her teeth chattered with cold and fear. Hans Botha went to his wagon and got a bottle of peach brandy, from which he poured into a tin pannikin, giving us each a stiff dram, and making attempts to be cheerful as he did so. But his affected jocularity only seemed to depress his comrades then more. Certainly it depressed me. Now the light was growing, and we could see some way into the mist which still hung densely over the river. And now, there it was. From the other side of the hill, 1,000 yards or more from the lager, came a faint humming sound. It grew and grew till it gathered to a chant, the awful war chant of the Zulus. Soon I could catch the words. They were simple enough. We shall slay, we shall slay. Is it not so, my brothers? Our spears shall blush blood red. Is it not so, my brothers? For we are the sucklings of Chaka. Blood is our milk, my brothers. Awake, children of the Amtitois, awake, the vulture wheels, the jackal sniffs there. Awake, children of the Amtitois, cry aloud, ye ranged men, there is the foe, we shall slay them. Is it not so, my brothers? Siji, Siji, Siji. Such is rough translation of that hateful chant, which to this very day I often seem to hear. It does not look particularly imposing on paper, but if, while we waited to be killed, the reader could have heard it as it rolled through the still air from the throats of nearly 3,000 warriors, singing all to time, he would have found it impressive enough. Now the shields began to appear over the brow of the rise. They came to companies, each company about 90 strong. Altogether, there were 31 companies. I counted them. When all were over, they formed themselves into a triple line, then trotted down the slope towards us. At a distance of 150 yards or just out of the shot of such guns as we had in those days, they halted and began singing again. Yonder is the kraal of the white man, a little kraal, my brothers. We shall eat it up, we shall trample it flat, my brothers. But where are the white man's cattle? Where are his oxen, my brothers? This question seemed to puzzle them a good deal, for they sang the song again and again. At last a herald came forward, a great man with ivory rings about his arm, and putting his hands to his mouth, called out to us, asking where our cattle were. Hans Botha climbed on the top of a wagon and roared out that they might answer that question themselves. Then the herald called again, saying that he saw the cattle had been sent away. We shall go and find the cattle, he said. Then we shall come and kill you, because without cattle you must stop where you are. But if we wait to kill you before we get to the cattle, they may have trekked too far for us to follow. And if you try to run away, we shall easily catch you, white man. This struck me as a very odd speech, for the Zulus generally attack any enemy first and take his cattle afterwards. Still, there was a certain amount of plausibility about it. While I was still wondering what it all might mean, the Zulus began to run past us in companies towards the river. Suddenly, a shout announced that they had found the spoor of the cattle, and the whole impi of them started down it at a run till they vanished over a rise about a quarter of a mile away. We waited for half an hour or more, but nothing could we see of them. Now I wonder if the devils have really gone, said Hans Botha to me. It is very strange. I'll go and see, said Indaba Zimbi. If you will come with me, Makomaza, we can creep to the top of the ridge and look over. At first I hesitated, but curiosity overcame me. I was young in those days and weary with suspense. Very well, I said, we will go. So we started. I had my elephant gun and ammunition. Indabazimbi had his medicine bag and the asage. We crept to the top of the rise like sportsmen stalking a buck. The slope on the other side was strewn with rocks, among which grew bushes and tall grass. They must have gone down the donga, I said to Indabazimbi. I can't see one of them. As I spoke, there came a roar of men all around me. From every rock, from every tuft of grass, rose a Zulu warrior. Before I could turn, before I could lift a gun, I was seized and thrown. Hold him! Hold the white spirit fast! Cried a voice. Hold him, or he will slip away like a snake. Don't hurt him, but hold him fast. Let Indaba Zimbi walk by his side. I turned on Indaba Zimbi. You black devil, you have betrayed me, I cried. Wait and see, Mukmazan, he answered coolly. Now the fight is going to begin.